Dunchil swayed and was about to fall, but someone's compassionate hands steadied him. The front curtain fell and concealed all those present on stage. Frenzied applause shook the theatre, to the extent that Nicanor Ivanovich thought he saw the lights quake in the chandeliers. When the black front curtain rose again, the stage contained no one except for the solitary actor. He brought on a second bout of applause, bowed, and spoke. "In the person of Dunchil, we have seen a typical ass in our programme. As I had the pleasure of saying yesterday, the clandestine hoarding of foreign currency is absurd. It cannot be used under any circumstances, I assure you. Take this Dunchil, for instance. He receives an excellent salary and wants for nothing. He has a lovely apartment, a wife, and a beauty of a mistress. But no, rather than living in peace and quiet, having turned in the currency and the gemstones, this avaricious dolt got himself exposed in front of everybody, and ended up with a major marital problem as well. And so, who would like to turn in theirs? No one? In that case, the next number in our programme. A famous stage talent, the actor Sava Potapovich Kurolyesov, who has been specially invited to perform excerpts from The Covetous Knight by the poet Pushkin. The promised Kurolyesov appeared on stage without delay. He turned out to be a tall, meaty, clean-shaven man in a tailcoat and white necktie. Without any sort of introduction, he composed a grim face, moved his eyebrows together, and spoke in an unnatural voice, glancing sidelong at the golden bell. "As the young hoodlum does await a rendezvous with some sly strumpet." And Kurolyesov told many bad things about himself. Nicanor Ivanovich heard Kurolyesov admit that a poor widow once knelt before him on her knees in the rain, howling, yet failed to move the actor's callous heart. Prior to his dream, Nicanor Ivanovich had no knowledge whatsoever of the poet Pushkin's writing, even though he knew the famous poet personally and would daily come up with phrases like, "And who's going to pay the rent, Pushkin?" Or, "So I guess it was Pushkin who stole the light bulb from the stairwell," or, "Perhaps Pushkin will buy the heating fuel for us." Now, having become acquainted with one of his works, Nicanor Ivanovich grew sad. He imagined a woman on her knees in the rain, surrounded by orphans, and thought involuntarily, "What a bastard that Kurolyesov." The latter, raising his voice with every word, kept on confessing. He managed to utterly confuse Nicanor Ivanovich by suddenly addressing someone not on the stage, and then replying for that person. He would call himself king and baron and father and son, and address himself both formally and familiarly. Nicanor Ivanovich understood only that the actor died a wicked death, crying out, "Keys, my keys!" The actor then fell to the floor, gasping, and carefully tearing off his tie. Having died, Kurolyesov rose up, brushed the dust from his trousers, bowed, smiled a fake smile, and left to the sound of weak applause. As for the MC, he spoke thus. "We have just heard Sava Potapovich's fantastic rendition of The Covetous Knight. This particular knight hoped to be surrounded by frolicking nymphs and expected many other pleasant things in that vein to occur. But, as you can see, none of that happened. No nymphs came running to him, no muses brought tribute, and he never erected any glorious halls. On the contrary, he ended up most poorly, died of a stroke on his chests of foreign currency and gemstones, and to hell with him. I warn you that if you do not turn in your currency, you will end up like him, if not worse." whether it was Pushkin's poetry or the MC's prosaic speech that made the greatest impression. A hesitant voice came suddenly from the audience. "I am turning in currency." "Please, join me on the stage," the MC invited politely, peering into the dark theatre. A blonde gentleman of diminutive stature appeared on the stage. Judging by his face, he had not shaved for approximately 3 weeks. "Pardon me, but what is your name?" the MC inquired. "Nikolai Kanafkin," the man replied bashfully. "Yeah, pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kanafkin. So—" "I'm turning it in," Kanafkin said quietly. "How much?" $1,000 and 20 gold 10 pieces. "Bravo! Is that all you've got?" The announcer stared Kanafkin right in the eyes, and Nikanor Ivanovich even thought he saw beams of light burst from those eyes and penetrate Kanafkin like X-rays. The theatre was breathless. "I believe him!" the actor exclaimed at last, and extinguished his glare. "I believe him! These eyes don't lie! After all, how many times have I told you that your principal mistake lies in underestimating the significance of a man's eyes? Understand that the tongue may conceal the truth, but the eyes never. You are asked an unexpected question. You don't even flinch. You take hold of yourself in a second. You know what to say to hide the truth, and you say it most convincingly, without a fold on your face stirring. But alas, the truth, perturbed by the question, sneaks into your eyes for but a moment from the bottom of your soul. And it's all over. It is seen, and you are caught." After pronouncing this convincing speech with much fervour, the actor inquired gently of Kanafkin, "Where is it hidden?" "At my aunt's, Porohovnikova, on Prachystenka Street." "Ah, this is— Hold on, this is Claudia Ilinichna, is it?" "Yes." "Oh, yes, 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 yes! That little house, across from a little garden? I know it, of course. But where do you stick 'em?" "In the cellar, in an Einem candy box." The actor clasped his hands. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" he cried in disappointment. "Why, they'll grow all mouldy and musty in there. Can you entrust currency to people like this? Huh? Like children or something, by God?" Kanafkin also realised his faux pas and general boorishness, and hung his unkempt head. "Money," continued the actor, "must be kept in the State Bank, in specially designed, dry, and well-guarded rooms, not in your auntie's cellar, where it can be ruined by rats, among other things. For shame, Kanafkin! You're a grown man, after all." Without a place to hide, Kanafkin resorted to picking the lapel of his jacket with his finger. "All right, then," the actor softened. "Bygones are bygones." And then he added suddenly, "Oh, and by the way, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, save the car a trip, this aunt of yours has some of her own, doesn't she, eh?" Kanafkin did not at all anticipate this turn of events, and quivered. The theatre fell silent. "Oh, Kanafkin," the MC said with affectionate reproach, "and to think I was just praising him. Looky here, he just messed up on me out of the blue. That's just silly, Kanafkin. I was just telling you about the eyes a minute ago. Anyone can see that the aunt has some. What are you tormenting us for?" "She does!" Kanafkin shouted boldly. "Bravo!" cried the MC. "Bravo!" the theatre roared fearsomely. When all was quiet, the MC congratulated Kanafkin, shook his hand, and offered him a car ride back to town. Speaking to someone in the wings, he instructed this same car to drop by the aunt's and invite her to the women's theatre programme. "I also wanted to ask you, the aunt never mentioned where she hides hers, does she?" the MC inquired, kindly offering Kanafkin a cigarette and a lit match. Lighting up, the latter scoffed mournfully. "I believe you, the actor said, sighing. "Forget a nephew, that old hag wouldn't tell the devil himself. Well, we sure will try to awaken the human side in her. Perhaps not all the strings are rotten in her stingy little soul. All the best, Kanafkin." The happy Kanafkin departed. The actor inquired whether anyone else wanted to turn in currency, but was met with silence. "Silly people, by God," the actor said, shrugging, and disappeared behind the curtain. The lights turned off, and there was darkness for a while. A nervous tenor came from far off, singing, "Great heaps of gold there be, and all of them belong to me." 2 rounds of applause came from somewhere far away. "Some lady turning it in at the women's theatre," Nikanor Ivanovitch's red-headed, bearded neighbour said suddenly, and added with a sigh, "Oh, if it weren't for my geese—" "I have fighting geese in Leonozova, my dear fellow. I fear they'll kick the bucket without me. A fighting bird is a tender creature. He needs great care. Oh, if it weren't for the geese, Pushkin, that's nothing." And he went on sighing. The theatre lit up brightly, and Nikanor Ivanovitch dreamt that cooks poured in from all the doors, wearing white hats and carrying ladles. Their assistants dragged in a cauldron of soup and a cart with sliced rye bread. The audience livened up. The cheerful cooks dashed between the spectators, pouring soup into bowls and handing out bread. "Eat up, guys," the cook shouted, "and turn in your currency. Why sit here for nothing? As if you really want to guzzle down this swill. Go home, have a drink, have a bite. Nice." "Let's say you, Pops, why are you here?" a fat cook with a red neck said directly to Nikanor Ivanovitch, handing him a bowl with a solitary leaf of cabbage floating in some liquid. "I don't have any! None! None!" Nikanor Ivanovitch cried in a terrible voice. "Do you understand? None!" "None?" roared the cook in a deep, menacing voice. "None?" he asked in a female voice. "None? None?" he muttered soothingly, turning into the nurse, Praskovya Fyodorovna. She was shaking Nikanor Ivanovitch gently by the shoulder as he moaned in his sleep. The cooks dissolved, and the theatre fell apart together with its curtain. Through his tears, Nikanor Ivanovitch perceived his room in the clinic. The 2 men in white coats were not unceremonious cooks, harassing people with their advice, but doctors. Praskovya Fyodorovna was not holding a bowl, but a small, gauze-covered tray with a syringe on it. "What's the deal, after all?" Nikanor Ivanovitch demanded bitterly during his injection. "I don't have any, and that's that. Let Pushkin turn in his currency. I have none." "None, none," soothed the kind-hearted Praskovya Fyodorovna. "And no means no." Nikanor Ivanovitch felt better after the injection, and fell into a completely dreamless sleep. But through his cries, the unrest spread into room 120, where the patient woke up and began to look for his head, and to room 118, where the unknown master became distressed and wrung his hands as he looked at the moon, remembering that last bitter autumn night of his life, the strip of light under the basement door, the dishevelled hair. From room 118, the unrest crossed the balcony to Ivan, who woke up and began to cry. But the doctor quickly pacified all the troubled heads of sorrow, and they began to fall asleep. Ivan was the last to go, with dawn already breaking over the river. After the medicine inundated his body, serenity came, washing over him like a wave. His body relaxed, and drowsiness coated his head in a warm breeze. He fell asleep, and the last thing he heard was the pre-dawn twittering of birds in the woods. But soon they fell silent, and he began to dream that the sun was already setting over Bald Mountain, and that this mountain was surrounded by a double cordon. Chapter 16. The Execution. The sun was already setting over Bald Mountain, and this mountain was surrounded by a double cordon. The cavalry ailer that cut through the procurator's path around midday trotted out to the city's Hebron gate. A path had already been cleared for it. The infantrymen of the Cappadocian cohort had pushed aside the masses of people, mules and camels. Raising white pillars of dust to the sky as it trotted, the ailer came to an intersection of two roads, one leading south to Bethlehem, and the other northwest to Jaffa. The ailer flew off down the northwest road. The same Cappadocians were strung out along the side of the road, having already chased aside all the caravans hurrying to the festival in Yerushalayim. Leaving their temporary striped tents that were pitched right on the grass, crowds of pilgrims stood behind the Cappadocians. After about a mile, the ailer overtook the second cohort of the Lightning Legion, and after another mile was the first to arrive at the foot of Bald Mountain. Here it dismounted, the commander separated the ailer into squads, and they cordoned off the entire foot of the low hill, leaving only one approach from the Jaffa road free. Some time later, the second cohort reached the hill, ascended to the next tier, and encircled the top in a wreath. Last came the sentry commanded by Mark the Rat-Slayer, walking in two lines along the edges of the road. In between the lines, convoyed by the secret guard, rode a cart containing the 3 condemned men with white boards hanging from their necks. Each board contained the inscription, "Robber and Mutineer," in both Aramaic and Greek. The first cart was followed by others, loaded with freshly chopped posts, with crossbars, ropes, shovels, buckets, and axes. 6 executioners rode on these carts. Behind them, on horseback, rode Mark the Centurion, the head of Yerushalayim's temple guard, and the same hooded man that Pilate had conferred with briefly in a darkened room of the palace. A line of soldiers brought up the rear of the procession. Only then came approximately 2,000 gapers, who were braving the hellish heat to observe the interesting spectacle. The gapers from the city were now being joined by curious pilgrims, who were given unrestricted access to the tail of the procession. To the shrill yells of criers accompanying the column and broadcasting what Pilate had shouted at noon, the procession pulled on to Bald Mountain. The ailer allowed everyone onto the second level, while the second sentry only admitted those who had a part in the execution to the very top. Then, manoeuvring quickly, the sentry spread the crowd all around the hill, positioning the people between the infantry cordon above and the cavalry cordon below. They could now witness the execution through the sparse chain of infantrymen. And so, over 3 hours had passed since the procession ascended the mountain. The sun was already setting over Bald Mountain, but the heat was still unbearable. The soldiers in both cordons suffered from heat and boredom, inwardly cursing the 3 criminals and sincerely wishing them a most speedy death. His forehead wet and his white shirt dark with sweat, the short commander of the ailer was situated at the foot of the hill, near the open road to the top. Time and again he would approach the leather bucket belonging to the first squad and scoop handfuls of water from it to drink and to moisten his turban. Achieving some degree of relief, he would return to pacing back and forth on the dusty road leading to the summit, his long sword banging against his laced-up leather boot. The commander wished to set an example of endurance for his cavalrymen but, pitying the soldiers, he allowed them to stick their lances in the ground in the shape of pyramids and drape their white cloaks over them. It was under these tents that the Syrians hid from the merciless sun. The buckets emptied quickly, and men from different squads took turns bringing water from the gully that lay towards the city, where, in the feeble shade of emaciated mulberries, a muddy stream lived out its last days in the diabolical heat. The bored horse handlers stood here as well, holding the subdued horses and trying to catch the shifting shade. The languishing of the soldiers was understandable, as were their curses directed at the criminals. Fortunately, the procurator's concerns about civil disturbances that could take place during the execution in his hated city of Yerushalayim turned out to be unjustified. And when the execution entered the 4th hour, not a single person was to be found, contrary to expectation, between the upper infantry and lower cavalry cordons. The sun scorched the crowd and chased it back to Yerushalayim. The only creatures within the sentries' lines were 2 dogs of unknown ownership that had somehow ended up on the hill. But even they were overcome by the heat and lay down, tongues hanging out, breathing heavily, and paying no attention to the green-backed lizards, the only things not afraid of the sun, and scurrying about amid the blistering rocks and creeping plants with large thorns. No one attempted to free the condemned, either in Yerushalayim itself, which was flooded with troops, or here on the cordoned hill, and the crowd returned to the city. The execution held absolutely nothing more of interest, while the city was already busy with preparations for the great holiday of Passover, which began in the evening. The Roman infantry, on the upper level, suffered even more than the cavalry. The only thing that Centurion Ratslayer allowed his soldiers was to remove their helmets and don white headbands moistened with water. However, they had to remain standing with spears in hand. Himself wearing an identical headband, but dry, he paced a short distance away from the group of executioners, without even removing the decorative silver lion heads from his shirt, without taking off his greaves, sword, or knife. The sun beat straight down on the centurion, unable to cause him any harm, and the lion heads were impossible to look at. The silver practically boiled in the sun, eating away at the eyes with its blinding glare. Ratslayer's disfigured face showed neither fatigue nor annoyance, and it seemed as if the giant centurion could pace like this all day, all night, and another day. In other words, as long as need be. Pace just like this, hands on heavy belts with copper medallions. Stare just like this, alternating between the posts with the condemned and the soldiers in the line. Kick the toe of his shaggy boot just like this, knocking aside the time-whitened human bones and small flint rocks that found their way under his feet. The hooded man placed himself on a 3-legged stool, not far from the posts, and sat in contented immobility, occasionally poking in the sand with a twig out of boredom. It would not be entirely correct to say that there wasn't a single person left beyond the line of legionnaires. There was one, but he was simply not visible to most. Rather than staying on the side where the road was left open to the top, the most convenient location to watch the execution, he positioned himself on the northern side, where the hill was irregular rather than level and accessible, where, amid the pitfalls and gaps, a sickly fig tree tried to survive in a crevice, clinging to waterless earth, cursed by the heavens. It was under that very tree, which failed to provide even a semblance of shade, that this solitary observer, not a participant in the execution, was located, sitting on a stone from the very beginning, for the 4th hour now. Indeed, he had chosen not the best, but the worst location to witness the execution. But even he could see the posts, see the 2 shining spots on the centurion's chest beyond the lines. For a man who clearly wished to remain unnoticed and undisturbed by anyone, this appeared to be more than sufficient. 4 hours ago, however, at the onset of the execution, this man behaved in a strikingly different, very conspicuous manner. Perhaps this was why he had changed his behaviour and isolated himself. It was back then, when the procession was pulling through the cordon onto the summit, that he first arrived, and obviously late at that. Breathing heavily and pushing others aside, he did not walk but ran up the hill. Seeing the cordon close in front of him and everyone else, he pretended not to hear the annoyed shouts and made a naive attempt to break through the soldiers to the very spot of the execution, where the condemned men were already being taken off the cart. In return, he received a painful blow to the chest with the blunt end of a spear and jumped back from the soldiers, crying out not in pain, but in despair. He glanced at the legionnaire who struck him with hazy and utterly indifferent eyes, like a man who cannot sense physical pain. Coughing, panting, and clutching his chest, he ran around the hill, hoping to find some gap in the line on the northern side that he could slip through. But it was too late. The ring had closed, and the man, his face deformed by grief, was forced to abandon his attempts to break through to the carts where the posts had just been unloaded. These attempts would only have led to his capture, and being detained on that day was not at all a part of his plan. And so he went aside to the crevice, where it was calm and no one bothered him. Now, perched on his rock, the black-bearded man languished, his eyes watering from the sun and lack of sleep. He would sigh, opening his worn talus, transformed from blue to dirty grey by long journeys, and exposing his chest, bruised by the spear, grimy sweat running down its surface. He would raise his eyes to the sky in unbearable anguish, watching the 3 vultures that had long been floating in great circles high above in anticipation of the impending feast. He would peer hopelessly at the yellow earth, seeing only a half-wrecked canine skull with lizards darting around it. The man's suffering was so great that at times he would talk to himself. "Oh, what a fool I am," he muttered, swaying back and forth on the rock in heartbreaking pain and clawing at his dark chest with his nails. "A fool, a silly girl, a coward. I am no man. I am carrion." He would fall silent, hanging his head, and then revive himself with a drink of warm water from a wooden flask. He would grab at his knife, hidden on his chest under the talus, or at the piece of parchment lying before him on the stone next to a stylus and a bottle of ink. The parchment already contained some words. "Time passes as I, Matthew Levi, sit on Bald Mountain, and still there is no death." Further, "The sun sets, and still no death." Now Matthew Levi picked up the sharp stylus and hopelessly wrote down the following: "God, why are you angry with him? Send him death." Having written this, he sobbed without tears and again wounded his chest with his nails. The cause of Levi's despair lay in the horrible misfortune that had befallen him and Yeshua, and also in the dire mistake that he, Levi, believed he had made. The day before yesterday, Yeshua and Levi had passed through Bethphage, near Jerusalem, where they had been guests of a certain gardener, who had taken a great liking to Yeshua's preaching. Both guests had worked in the garden all morning, helping their host, and intended to walk to Jerusalem in the evening cool. But Yeshua appeared to be in a hurry, saying he had some pressing business in the city, and left alone around noon. Here lay Matthew Levi's first mistake. Why had he let him go alone? Come evening, Matthew was not to go to Jerusalem. Some unexpected and horrible illness struck him. He was shaking, his body filled with fire, his teeth chattered, and he would demand water every other minute. He could not go anywhere. He collapsed on a horse blanket in the gardener's shed and lay there until dawn on Friday, when the ailment released Levi as suddenly as it had seized him. Though he was still weak and his legs trembled, he bid his host goodbye and headed for Jerusalem, tormented by an odd premonition of catastrophe. There, he found out that his premonition had not deceived him. The catastrophe had happened. Levi was in the crowd and heard the procurator pronounce the sentence. When the condemned were being taken to the mountain, Matthew Levi ran alongside the line of soldiers in the crowd of onlookers, trying to secretly alert Yeshua somehow that at least he, Levi, was there with him, that he had not abandoned him on the final journey, and prayed that death find Yeshua as quickly as possible. But of course Yeshua, staring far off at his destination, could not see him. And then, when the procession had moved about half a mile down the road, Matthew, who was being shoved around in the crowd right next to the line of soldiers, had a simple and brilliant idea. Immediately, in his hot temper, he showered himself with curses for not having thought of it sooner. The soldiers did not maintain a dense line. There were gaps between them. With enough dexterity and a very precise calculation, one could crouch and slip in between two legionnaires, reach the cart and jump on top of it. Then Yeshua would be saved from suffering. A moment would be enough to strike Yeshua in the back with a knife, crying, "Yeshua, I save you and follow you. I, Matthew, your one and true disciple." And were God to bless him with another free instant, he could stab himself as well, avoiding death on the posts. However, this last notion was not very important to Levi, the former tax collector. He did not care how he would die. He only wished that Yeshua, who had not done the slightest evil to anyone in his life, would escape torture. The plan was good, but the problem was that Levi had no knife with him, nor did he have any money. Furious with himself, Levi climbed out of the crowd and ran back to the city. His inflamed head was preoccupied with the single feverish thought of how he must immediately, by any means necessary, obtain a knife in the city and catch up to the procession in time. He ran up to the gate, manoeuvring in the mob of caravans being sucked into the city, and saw the open door of a bread shop on his left. Breathing heavily after his dash down the scorching road, Levi composed himself and walked into the shop in a most stately fashion. He greeted the keeper behind the counter, asked her to get the top loaf from the shelf, preferring it to others for some reason, and then, when she turned around, silently and quickly grabbed from the counter the best thing there could be, a long bread knife, sharp as a razor, and darted immediately from the shop. A few minutes later, he was back on the Jaffa Road, but the procession was nowhere to be seen. He ran. At times he had to collapse in the dust and lie there motionless to catch his breath. Thus he would lie, astounding the people heading to Jerusalem on mule and on foot. He would lie, listening to his heart pound not only in his chest, but also in his skull and in his ears. Catching his breath, he would jump up and continue running, but his progress grew slower and slower. When he finally saw the clouds of dust raised by the long procession ahead, it was already at the foot of the hill. "Oh, God," Levi moaned, realizing that he would be late. And late he was. When the 4th hour of execution had passed, Levi's suffering reached its peak, and he flew into a rage. Rising from the stone, he threw the knife, uselessly stolen, he now thought, to the ground, crushed the flask with his foot, depriving himself of water, tore the keffir from his head, grabbed at his thin hair, and began to curse himself. He cursed himself, uttering nonsensical words, growling and spitting, denouncing his mother and father for bringing a fool into the world. Seeing that the cursing had no effect, that nothing had changed in the blistering sun, he closed his eyes, clenched his dry fists, and raised them to the sky, towards the sun that sank ever lower, lengthening the shadows as it fell into the Mediterranean Sea, and demanded an immediate miracle from God. He demanded that God immediately send Yeshua death. Opening his eyes, He discovered that the hill had not changed, except for the fact that the blazing spots on the centurion's chest had extinguished. The sun now directed its rays at the backs of the condemned men, who were facing Yerushalayim. Then Levi shouted, "I curse you, God!" In a hoarse voice, he cried that he realized God's injustice, and that he trusted him no longer. "You are deaf," Levi growled, "for if you were not, you would have heard me and killed him at once." Closing his eyes, Levi waited for fire to rain from the sky and strike him down. This did not happen, and without opening his eyelids, Levi continued to shout mocking and offensive statements at the heavens. He cried of his complete disillusionment and of the existence of other gods and religions. Yes, another god would never have allowed a man like Yeshua to burn on a post in the sun. "I was wrong," Levi shouted, his voice almost gone. "You are a god of evil. Or are your eyes completely obscured by the smoke from the temple's incense burners? Have your ears ceased to hear anything but the priest's trumpeting? You are not an omnipotent God. You are a dark God. I curse you, God of thieves, their patron and their soul." Something blew into the former tax collector's face, and something rustled under his feet. It blew again, and Levi opened his eyes and saw that, whether by force of his curses or some other cause, everything in the world had changed. The sun disappeared before reaching the sea, whence it sank every evening. The storm cloud that swallowed it rose menacingly and relentlessly in the western sky, its edges already boiled with white froth, and its smoky black belly was tinted yellow. The cloud rumbled and occasionally spilled fiery threads. Pillars of dust flew along the Jaffa road and through the barren Hinnon valley, propelled over the pilgrims' tents by a sudden wind. Levi fell silent, trying to figure out whether the storm about to cover Yerushalayim would bring any change in the unfortunate Yeshua's fate. And at once, looking at the threads of fire slicing up the cloud, he began to beg for lightning to strike Yeshua's post. Looking in repentance at the clear sky, not yet devoured by the cloud, where the vultures were swerving to avoid the storm, Levi thought that he had been foolishly hasty with his curses. Now God would not listen to him. Levi turned his gaze towards the foot of the hill, his eyes glued to the area where the cavalry regiment had been strung out, and saw that it had changed significantly. From high up, Levi could see clearly the soldiers stirring, pulling their lances from the ground, and putting on their cloaks. He could see the horse handlers trotting towards the road, leading the black horses by their bridles. The regiment was on the move, this much was clear. Spitting and shielding his face from the dust with his arm, Levi tried to figure out what the cavalry's departure could mean. He shifted his gaze higher, and made out a figure in a crimson military chlamys ascending to the place of execution. And the former tax collector's heart went cold in anticipation of the blissful end. The man ascending the mountain in the 5th hour of the criminal's suffering was a cohort commander who had galloped from Yerushalayim accompanied by an orderly. The line of soldiers parted at Ratslayer's motion, and the centurion saluted the tribune. Taking Ratslayer aside, the latter whispered something to him. The centurion saluted a second time and headed towards the group of executioners, who were sitting on the rocks at the foot of the posts. Meanwhile, the tribune approached the man sitting on the three-legged stool, who rose politely to greet the visitor. The tribune quietly said something to him as well, and they both went to the posts. They were joined by the head of the temple guard. Glancing sidelong in disgust at the dirty rags lying on the ground near the posts, rags which recently served as the criminals' clothing and had been rejected by the executioners, Ratslayer summoned 2 of their number and ordered, "Follow me." A horse nonsensical ditty came from the nearest post. Hestus, who hung on it, had lost his mind towards the end of the 3rd hour from the sun and the flies. Now he quietly sang something about grapes, swaying his turbaned head occasionally, causing the flies to rise half-heartedly from his face and set right back down on it. On the 2nd post, Dismas was suffering more than the other two, because awareness had not left him. He swayed his head regularly and often, left and right, so that his ears struck his shoulders. Yeshua was more fortunate than either. In the very first hour, he began to pass out and soon lost consciousness, his head drooping in its unravelled turban. As a result, the flies and wasps had completely covered him, his face disappearing under the shifting black mass. Fat horseflies sat in his groin, on his stomach and under his armpits, sucking on the exposed yellow body. Obeying the signs of the hooded man, one of the executioners picked up a spear, and the other brought a bucket and a sponge to the post. The first executioner raised the spear and tapped first one and then the other of Yeshua's arms, stretched out and bound to the horizontal bar of the post with ropes. The body, with protruding ribs, shuddered. The executioner passed the tip of the spear over the stomach. Then Yeshua raised his head, sending the flies buzzing up to expose the hanging man's face. Swollen from bites, eyes inflamed, it was unrecognizable. Peeling his eyelids open, Hanotzri glanced down. His eyes, usually clear, were now cloudy. "Hanotzri," said the executioner. Hanotzri moved his swollen lips and answered in the hoarse voice of a criminal. "What do you want? Why do you approach me?" "Drink," the executioner said, and the water-soaked sponge rose to Yeshua's lips on the tip of the spear. Joy flashed in Yeshua's eyes. He pressed against the sponge and began to absorb the moisture greedily. Dismas's voice came from the neighbouring post. "Unfair! I am the same criminal he is." Dismas strained, but could not move, his arms bound to the crossbar in 3 places by rings of rope. He drew in his stomach, dug his nails into the ends of the crossbar, and kept his head turned towards Yeshua's post. Hatred burned in Dismas's eyes. A cloud of dust enveloped the area. It grew quite dark. When the dust flew away, the centurion shouted, "Silence on the 2nd post!" Dismas fell silent. Yeshua tore himself away from the sponge, and trying to make his voice sound gentle and convincing, and failing, asked the executioner hoarsely, "Give him a drink." It grew darker by the minute. The storm cloud filled half the sky as it headed towards Yerushalayim, saturated with black moisture and fire. Steaming white clouds flew ahead of it. A flash came right above the hill, followed by a thunderclap. The executioner removed the sponge from the spear. "Praise the generous hegemon," he whispered solemnly, and stabbed Yeshua lightly in the heart. The latter shuddered and whispered, "Hegemon." Blood ran down his stomach, the lower jaw twitched convulsively, and his head fell. At the 2nd stroke of thunder, the executioner was giving Dismas a drink, and with the same words, "Praise the hegemon," killed him as well. Hestas, his mind gone, shrieked in fear when the executioner appeared next to him. But when the sponge touched his lips, he growled something unintelligible and sank his teeth into it. A few seconds later, his body, too, went limp as much as the ropes would allow. The hooded man followed in the footsteps of the executioner and the centurion, himself trailed by the head of the temple guard. Stopping by the first post, The hooded man looked over the bloodied Yeshua carefully, touched the man's foot with his white hand, and said to his companions, "Dead." The same happened by the other 2 posts. After this, the tribune signalled to the centurion and turned to leave the summit together with the head of the temple guard and the hooded man. The sky was half dark, crisscrossed by lightning. Fire spurted from above, and the centurion's cry, "Raise the cordon!" drowned in thunder. The happy soldiers came running from the summit, strapping on their helmets. The darkness enveloped Yerushalayim. The downpour came suddenly, catching the sentry halfway down the hill. The water fell so fiercely that as the soldiers ran down, raging torrents already surged at their backs. The soldiers slipped and fell in the soggy clay, hurrying to the level road where the cavalry, drenched to the bone and barely visible through the wall of water, was departing for Yerushalayim. A few minutes later, only one man was left on the hill amid the smoky brew of storm, water, and fire, shaking his conveniently stolen knife, falling from the slippery ledges, grasping at anything nearby, and occasionally crawling on his knees. He headed for the posts. He would disappear in complete darkness, only to be illuminated by flickering light a moment later. He was already up to his ankles in water when he made it to the posts. Tearing off his heavy, waterlogged talus and remaining in his shirt, he clung to Yeshua's feet. He cut the ropes on the shins, climbed onto the lower crossbar, hugging Yeshua, and freed the hands from the binds. Yeshua's wet, naked body fell on Levi and pinned him to the ground. Levi wanted to hoist it immediately onto his shoulders, but something stopped him. He left the body lying in the water, head thrown back and arms spread out, and ran to the other posts, his feet sliding apart in the clay mud. He cut the ropes on them as well, and the 2 bodies plunged to the ground. Several minutes later, only 2 bodies and 3 empty posts remained on the top of the hill. The water hammered and turned the corpses. Neither Levi nor Yeshua's body were on top of the hill by then. Chapter 17. A Troublesome Day. Friday morning, on the day after the accursed séance, the Variety's entire staff, the bookkeeper, Vasily Stepanovich Lastochkin, 2 clerks, 3 typists, and both cashiers, as well as messengers, ushers, and cleaning ladies, in other words, all those present, were shirking their respective posts and duties. Instead, everyone was sitting on the windowsills facing Sedovaya and gazing at what transpired below by the wall of the Variety. A queue, numbering many thousands, stretched along this wall, 2 rows strong, its tail far away on Kudrinskaya Square. Some 20 scalpers, well known in Moscow's theatrical circles, stood at its head. The line carried on excitedly, attracting the attention of pedestrians streaming past, as it busily discussed the tantalizing tales of yesterday's incredible séance of black magic. The tales greatly flustered the bookkeeper, Vasily Stepanovich, who was not present at yesterday's show. The ushers told of God knows what. For instance, that following the famous séance, some ladies were running about in the streets indecently dressed, and so on like that. The modest and quiet Vasily Stepanovich could only flap his eyelids as he took in the yarns about all these wonders. He had no idea what action to take, and at the same time action absolutely had to be taken, and by none other than him, for he was the highest-ranking official in the Variety's entire remaining crew. By 10 o'clock, the line of hopefuls swelled to such proportions that the police got wind of it. Both regular and mounted detachments were deployed with astounding swiftness, bringing some semblance of order to the line. Even organised, however, the mile-long serpent looked very tempting, and drove the folk on Sedovaya to utter astonishment. This was outside. Inside the Variety, things were also far from perfect. From the crack of dawn, telephones began ringing in Likhodiev's office, Rimsky's office, the bookkeeping department, the box office, and Varyonika's office. At first, Vasily Stepanovich tried to answer the calls. The cashier would also pick up the phone. The ushers would mutter something into the receivers, but finally they gave up altogether. After all, there was absolutely nothing to say to demands for the whereabouts of Likhodiev, Varyonika, and Rimsky. At first they tried the excuse, "Likhodiev's at home," but the callers would inevitably reply that they had already phoned the apartment and were told that Likhodiev was at the Variety. A distressed lady called asking for Rimsky, and they suggested she call his wife. Crying, the receiver proclaimed that she was the wife and that Rimsky was nowhere to be found. Things were becoming absurd. The cleaning lady had already told everyone that when she came to Rimsky's office to tidy up, she saw the door wide open, the lights on, the garden window broken, the chair lying on the floor, and not a soul in the office. Soon after 10 o'clock, Madame Rimsky burst into the Variety, weeping and wringing her hands. The dazed Vasily Stepanovich had no way of helping her, and at 10:30, the police arrived. Their first and completely logical question was, "What's going on here, folks? What's the matter?" The crew stepped back, leaving behind a pale and tense Vasily Stepanovich. There was little choice but to call things by their proper names and admit that the Variety's administration, in the persons of the director, the finance director, and the manager, had vanished to places unknown. That following yesterday's séance, the MC had to be taken to a mental institution. Finally, that the aforementioned séance was, to put it concisely, nothing short of scandalous. The weeping Madame Rimsky was pacified to the extent that it was possible and sent home by the police, who took a far greater interest in the cleaning lady's description of the finance director's office. The staff were asked to return to their posts and get busy, and in a short while detectives appeared in the building, accompanied by a sharp-eared, muscular, ash-coloured dog with extremely intelligent eyes. The buzz spread instantly among the staff that the hound was none other than the famous Ace of Diamonds. And indeed, it was he. His behaviour astounded all. As soon as Ace of Diamonds ran into the finance director's office, he growled, baring his monstrous yellow fangs, then dropped onto his belly and crawled towards the broken window with a mixture of anguish and rage in his eyes. Conquering his fear, he leapt up suddenly on the windowsill, threw back his sharp muzzle, and let out a savage and vicious howl. Growling and shaking, he refused to leave the window, and even made to jump out. The dog was removed from the office and released in the vestibule, where he left via the front door and led those following him to a taxi stand. Here he lost the trail. After that, Ace of Diamonds was taken away. The investigation headquartered itself in Varyonika's office, where all Variety staff members who had witnessed the events of yesterday's séance were summoned, one by one. It should be noted that at every step the detectives were accosted by unforeseen difficulties. The thread kept tearing in their hands. Were there posters? Yes, but during the night they had been plastered over with new ones, and now, so strike me dead, there wasn't a single one left. Where did this magician come from, anyway? Who knew? So then, there must have been a contract. One would think so, said the agitated Vasily Stepanovich. And if there had been a contract, it must have passed through the bookkeeping department. Indubitably, Vasily Stepanovich replied worriedly. So where is it? Not here, the bookkeeper said, spreading his arms and growing progressively more pale. And indeed, not a trace of the contract could be found. Not in the bookkeeping office, not in the finance director's, not in Likhodiev's, not in Varyonika's. So what was the magician's name? Vasily Stepanovich had no idea, as he was not at last night's séance. The ushers did not know. The cashier frowned and frowned, thought, and finally said, Woland, I think. Or perhaps it was not Woland, perhaps not, perhaps it was Phalland. It was quickly determined that the Travellers' Bureau had heard absolutely nothing of any magicians, be they Wolands or Phallands. The messenger Karpov reported that the magician was apparently staying at Likhodiev's apartment. The apartment was immediately inspected. No magicians were found. Likhodiev himself was missing as well. Grunia, the maid, was missing, and no one knew where she had gone. The chairman of the Tenants' Association, Nikanor Ivanovich, was missing. Prolyezhnev was missing. The situation was utterly ridiculous. The entire upper administration had vanished, and a strange and scandalous séance had taken place yesterday, but no one knew who had produced or instigated it. In the meantime, noon approached, and the box office was due to open. But of course, this was entirely out of the question. A giant piece of cardboard was immediately hung on the doors of the Variety, bearing the words, "Today's performance is cancelled." Unrest spread through the queue from the head down, but nonetheless it began to break up, and an hour later there was not a trace of it left. The detectives left to continue their work elsewhere. The staff was dismissed with the exception of the watchman, and the doors of the Variety were locked. Two urgent tasks now lay before Vasily Stepanovich, the bookkeeper. The first was to go to the Commission on Shows and Lighter Entertainment and report on yesterday's events. The second was to drop by the entertainment financial sector in order to turn in yesterday's earnings. 21,711 roubles. The careful and responsible Vasily Stepanovich wrapped the money in a newspaper, tied it up with string, and placed the package in his briefcase. Knowing the procedure well, he headed for the taxi stand instead of the bus or tram stop. As soon as the drivers of the three available cars saw the passenger hurrying towards their lot carrying a fat briefcase, all three drove away empty right under his nose, eyeing him angrily for some reason. Stunned by this circumstance, the bookkeeper stood transfixed for quite some time, trying to figure out what it could mean. An empty cab came by a few minutes later, and the driver grimaced as soon as he saw the passenger. "Are you free?" Vasily Stepanovich asked with a surprised cough. "Show me the money," the driver replied angrily, without looking at the passenger. Increasingly amazed, the bookkeeper stuck the precious briefcase under his arm, pulled a 10 out of his wallet, and showed it to the driver. "No way," the latter tersely said. "I beg your pardon," the bookkeeper began, but the driver interrupted him. "Got any threes?" Utterly confused, the bookkeeper pulled out 2 threes and showed them to the driver. "Get in," the man shouted, and punched the flag of his meter so hard he almost broke it. "Let's go." "No change, is that it?" the bookkeeper asked sheepishly. "A pocket chock full of change," the driver bawled, and his bloodshot eyes appeared in the rearview mirror. "Third time today, same thing with the other cars. Some son of a bitch gives me a 10, I give him change 4.50, so he gets out, the bastard. 5 minutes later I look, instead of a 10, it's a label from a seltzer bottle." Here the driver uttered several unprintable words. "Another, near Zubovskaya, a 10, I give him 3 roubles, gets out. I go for my wallet, and there's a bee in there. Zap! Stings me right in the finger. Oh, you..." And again the driver squeezed in a few unprintable words. "No 10. Yesterday at the Variety," unprintable words, "some scum of a magician performed a séance with 10-rouble bills," unprintable words. The stupefied bookkeeper shivered and pretended he had never heard the word Variety before in his life, all the while thinking, "Oh, boy." Upon arriving at his destination, and paying the driver without incident, the bookkeeper entered the building and headed down the hall to the director's office. Even before he got there, he realized that he had come at a bad time. The offices of the Entertainment Commission were in turmoil. A messenger girl ran past the bookkeeper, her scarf sliding off her head and her eyes bulging. "Nothing, nothing, nothing, my dears!" she cried at no one in particular. "The jacket and the pants are there, but there's nothing inside." She vanished in a doorway, and the sound of breaking dishes came immediately from within. A familiar manager of the Commission's first sector ran out of the secretary's office and vanished without a trace, evidently in such a state that he did not recognize the bookkeeper. Shaken, the bookkeeper reached the secretary's office, which served as the ante-room of the Commission chairman's office, and his astonishment reached its limit. A menacing voice came from behind the closed door, undoubtedly belonging to Prokhor Petrovich, the chairman of the Commission. "Bawling someone out, is he?" thought the confused bookkeeper, and glancing round, saw something else entirely. In a leather armchair lay Prokhor Petrovich's personal secretary, the beautiful Anna Richardovna. Holding a wet handkerchief in her hand, she was weeping uncontrollably, with her head thrown back and her legs stretched out almost to the middle of the room. Anna Richardovna's entire chin was smeared in lipstick, and black streams of wet mascara ran down her peach-like cheeks from her eyelashes. Seeing someone come in, Anna Richardovna jumped up, dashed to the bookkeeper, and clutching at the lapels of his jacket, began to shake him and scream. "Thank God! At last someone brave enough! Everyone else left, everyone deserted! Let's go! Let's go to him! I don't know what to do!" And still weeping, she dragged the bookkeeper into the main office. The first thing the bookkeeper did in the office was drop his briefcase, even as every thought in his head turned upside down, and, one must say, with good reason. Behind a giant desk with a massive inkwell sat an empty suit, moving a dry, inkless pen across a piece of paper. The suit possessed a tie, and a fountain pen was sticking out of the jacket pocket, but neither neck nor head was present above the collar, just as no hands peeped out of the sleeves. The suit was immersed in its work, completely ignoring the chaos that reigned all around. Hearing someone enter, the suit sat back in its chair, and Prokhor Petrovich's familiar voice rang out from above the collar. "What is it? The sign on the door clearly says I am not available." The beautiful secretary shrieked, wrung her hands, and exclaimed, You see, he's not here, not here. Bring him back, bring him back." Someone peeped into the office, gasped, and flew back out. The bookkeeper felt his legs begin to shake and sat down on the corner of a chair, remembering, however, to pick up his briefcase. Clawing at the bookkeeper's jacket, Anna Richardovna bounced around him and screamed, "I always tried to stop him when he cursed. Now he's cursed himself straight to hell." The beauty ran up to the desk and exclaimed in a tender, melodic voice, a little nasal from all the crying, "Prosha, where are you?" "Who are you to call me Prosha?" the suit inquired disdainfully, sitting even further back in its chair. "He doesn't recognize me. Me, you see," wailed the secretary. "I'll thank you not to wail in my office," said the irritable striped suit, growing angry, and caught a fresh batch of documents with its sleeve, clearly intending to append instructions to every single one. "No, I can't bear to look at it, I just can't," Anna Richardovna cried, and ran back to the secretary's office, the bookkeeper racing behind her like a speeding bullet. "Imagine, I'm sitting here," Anna Richardovna narrated, quivering in agitation, and again latching on to the bookkeeper's sleeve. "And then a cat walks in. Black, huge, a behemoth of a cat. I naturally yell, 'Shoo!' The cat leaves, and this fat man walks in instead, also with a cat-like face, and says, 'Why are you shooing at the visitors, ma'am?' And zoom, straight to Prokhor Petrovich. I run after him, of course, and yell, 'Are you crazy?' And the insolent bastard goes straight to Prokhor Petrovich and sits down in a chair opposite him. Now he is the sweetest man, but edgy. He just explodes. No argument there. Nervous man, works like an ox. He explodes. 'How dare you barge in here unannounced?' And that insolent bastard, just imagine, slouches in the chair and says with a smile, Well, I'm just here to talk about a little business with you. Prokhor Petrovich explodes again. I'm busy. And the other one, just think of it, says, no, you're not. How do you like that? So, Prokhor Petrovich loses all his patience and screams, what the hell is this? Get him out of here, devil take me. And the other one, just imagine, smiles and says, devil take you, that can be arranged. And boom, I didn't even have time to scream. The cat-faced guy is gone, and the suit is just sitting there. Anna Richardovna howled, stretching open her now completely shapeless mouth. Choking on her sobs, she caught her breath and started to ramble incoherently. And it writes, it writes, it writes. It's madness. It talks on the phone. A suit. Everyone ran away faster than rabbits. The bookkeeper could only stand there and shake. But fate suddenly came to his rescue. The police, numbering 2 people, entered the office in a calm, businesslike manner. Seeing them, the beauty began to weep even harder, and jabbed her finger at the main office door. "Let's not cry, ma'am," the first man said calmly, while the bookkeeper, judging his continued presence to be most unnecessary, jumped out of the secretary's room and was back outdoors a minute later. A wind hummed in his head, as in a chimney, and fragments of the usher's tales about yesterday's cat and his part in the séance filtered through the humming. Hey, could this be our little kitty? Unable to get anywhere at the commission, the dutiful Vasily Stepanovich decided to visit its branch office, located on Vagankovsky Lane. And so as to calm himself a little, he made the journey there on foot. The Entertainment Commission's branch was situated in an old peeling mansion set back from the street, famous for the porphyry columns in its front hall. It was not the columns that awed visitors to the branch that day, however, but that which happened between them. Several visitors stood dumbfounded and stared at a girl sitting at a table covered with special entertainment-related literature that she had been selling. At the moment, the girl was not offering any literature to anyone and waved away concerned questions. All the while, at least 20 telephones were bursting with frenzied ringing from above, from below, from all around, in every department of the branch. Taking a break from her weeping, the girl suddenly gave a start and cried hysterically, "Here it goes again!" and unexpectedly began singing in a shaky soprano, "Glorious seascape, the sacred Baikal." A courier appeared on the stairs, shook his fist at someone, and joined the girl with his weak, faded baritone, "Glorious ship, an old salmon barrel." The courier's voice was joined by other faraway voices, the chorus grew, and finally the song roared in every corner of the building. In the nearby room, number 6, the location of the accounting office, someone's powerful hoarse bass particularly stood out. The chorus was accompanied by the growing rattle of telephones. "Hey, Barguzin, make the mighty waves roll," screamed the courier from the stairs. Tears rolled down the girl's face as she tried to clench her teeth, but her mouth opened by a will of its own, and she sang an octave above the courier. "This lad hasn't far to travel." The silent visitors were most astonished by the fact that the singers scattered in various parts of the building nonetheless managed to sing very harmoniously, as if the entire chorus was standing at attention in front of an invisible conductor. Pedestrians on Vagankovsky Lane paused by the mansion's fence, wondering at the merriment that reigned inside the branch office. As soon as the first verse came to an end, the singing stopped suddenly, again as if by a conductor's motion. The courier swore quietly and disappeared. Then the front door opened, revealing a man whose white coat protruded from underneath his summer jacket, and with him a policeman. "Do something, doctor, I beg you!" the girl cried hysterically. The branch secretary ran out to the staircase, and evidently burning up with shame and embarrassment, stuttered, "You see, doctor, we have a case of some sort of mass hypnosis here. Thus, It is imperative that—" Choking on his words, he did not finish his sentence, and instead burst out in a tenor, "Shilker-nerchinsk." "Dunce!" The girl had time to scream, but failed to explain who it was she was scolding. Instead, she forced out a roulade, and also began singing about Shilka and Nerchinsk. "Get a hold of yourself! Stop singing!" the doctor said to the secretary. The secretary showed every indication that he would give anything to stop singing, except that he could not. And together with the chorus, he informed the pedestrians outside that he was untouched in the woods by the ravenous beast, unscathed by the soldier's bullet. The moment the verse ended, the girl was the first to receive a dose of valerian from the doctor, who then ran after the secretary to administer it to everyone else. "Excuse me, miss," Vasily Stepanovich addressed the girl suddenly. "Have you had a black cat come in here a while back?" "Cat? What cat?" the girl yelled angrily. "We've got an ass in charge here, an ass! Let him hear! I'm telling everything," she added, and indeed went on to relate what happened. It turned out that the manager of the branch office, having completely ruined the lighter entertainment programme, according to the girl, suffered from a manic habit of forming various clubs for the employees. "Blowing smoke in his superior's eyes," the girl screamed. Over the course of the year, the manager had already organised a club dedicated to the study of Lermontov's poetry, as well as a chess and checkers, a ping-pong, and a horseback riding club. By summertime, he threatened a freshwater rowing club and a rock-climbing club. And then today, during lunch break, the manager walked in, "And he's got this son of a bitch on his arm," the girl narrated. "No one knows where he came from, checked pants, cracked pince-nez, and with this absolutely impossible filthy face." According to the girl, the manager immediately introduced him to everyone in the lunchroom as a known specialist in the field of organising choruses. The faces of the budding rock climbers darkened, but the manager immediately called for a positive attitude, whereas the specialist joked and poked and swore that singing takes up the teeniest bit of time while providing, incidentally, a whole damn truckload of benefits. Naturally, the girl informed, the first to jump in and join were Fanov and Kosarchuk, two well-known office toadies. Realising that the chorus could not be avoided, the other employees had to sign up as well. It was decided to sing at lunchtime, since all the remaining time was already being taken up by Lermontov and checkers. To set an example, the manager announced that he had a fine tenor, and then it all went on like a bad dream. The checkered choir-master specialist bellowed. "Do, mi, sol, do." He dragged out the timid from behind the cabinets, where they had sought to escape the singing, declared that Kosarchuk had perfect pitch, and began to whine, snivel, tap the tuning fork on his palm, ask for some compassion for an old choir-master singer, and beg them to strike up Grand Old Seascape. So they struck it up, and struck it up gloriously. The checkered fellow clearly knew his business. They finished the first verse. Here the choir-master excused himself, said, "Just be a minute," and vanished. At first they thought he really would return in a minute. Then 10 minutes passed, and he was still gone. Joy spread among the employees. The choir-master had bolted. And suddenly they began the second verse all by themselves, led by Kosarchuk, who, although he may not have had perfect pitch, did have a rather pleasant-sounding high tenor. They finished singing. No choir-master. They went back to their places, but had not even had time to sit down, when, against their will, they started singing again. Stop? Not a chance. A few minutes of silence, and they would strike up again. Silence. Strike up. Then they realised they were in trouble. The disgraced manager locked himself in his office. Here the girl's story was interrupted. The valerian did not do a thing. A quarter of an hour later, 3 trucks approached the mansion's fence on Vagankovsky and were boarded by the entire staff, led by the manager. As soon as the first truck rocked in the gateway and drove out into the lane, the employees, who were standing in the back and holding each other's shoulders, opened their mouths. The lane was filled with a popular song. The second truck joined the first, and then so did the third, and off they went. Unsurprised pedestrians, hurrying about their business, barely looked up at the trucks, assuming that a group tour was heading out to the country. The trucks were indeed headed out to the country, but the tour would end at Professor Stravinsky's clinic. Half an hour later, the utterly bewildered bookkeeper reached the entertainment financial sector, hoping to finally get rid of the cash. Taught by bitter experience, he first peeped cautiously into the oblong hall where the clerks were sitting behind matted glass barriers with gold lettering. The bookkeeper could not detect any sign of alarm or disruption. The place was quiet, as any respectable establishment should be. Vasily Stepanovich stuck his head in the window labelled Cash Deposits, greeted the unknown clerk, and asked politely for a deposit slip. "What for?" the clerk in the window asked. The bookkeeper was astonished. "I wish to make a deposit. I'm from the Variety." "One moment," the clerk replied, and immediately lowered a mesh over the opening in the glass. How odd, the bookkeeper thought. His surprise was quite justified. It was the first time in his life that he had encountered such circumstances. Everyone knows how difficult it is to obtain money. The process is always fraught with obstacles. But the bookkeeper could not recall a single case in his entire 30-year career when someone, be it an official or private person, had difficulty accepting money. But finally the mesh opened, and the bookkeeper leaned closer to the window. "How much do you have?" the clerk asked. 21,711 roubles. "Whoa," the clerk said ironically for some reason, and handed the bookkeeper a green slip. Knowing the form well, the bookkeeper filled it out in an instant and began to untie the string binding his package. As soon as he opened his bundle, his vision blurred, and he moaned painfully. Foreign money of all sorts flashed before his eyes. Here lay stacks of Canadian dollars, English pounds, Dutch guldens, Latvian laats, Estonian kroonies. "Here he is, one of those jokers from the Variety." A menacing voice boomed above the dumbstruck bookkeeper, and Vasily Stepanovich was arrested on the spot.